Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus. After a long delay, we return. As always, I am the death metal guy,
And I am the black metal guy.
and we are back with an episode that has probably, well, has certainly been a long time coming, but in maybe a little bit different of a format than you might expect. Before we get to that, real quick, if any of you are big fans of what we've been producing, the various kinds of content, and of course our main show, feel free to check us out on Patreon and consider subscribing at $5 and up to get access to the private Discord server and to just fund the creation of more and more bizarre shows like this. So, for those of you who are able to read and read the title of today's episode, you will see that we are discussing what I like to think of as kind of a movement in very extreme death metal that occurred really centered around the mid-2000s. And that is the time and place where extreme brutal death metal and gore grind starts to butt up very directly against noise in various interesting ways. This is a kind of stylistic diversion that has, for obvious reasons, never been extremely popular, but is near and dear to my heart. So, the conversation today is going to center around two records that I've referenced many times on the show and are two of my favorite albums of all time. And then, after that, I'm going to be taking the black metal guy on sort of a concise guided tour of some other more obscure stuff that hopefully you will all be interested in. The primary two records we're going to be looking at today are, I think the sort of two heads of this style rather undeniably that have a great deal of similarities in terms of sheer extremity, but radically different methods of portraying that. And those are going to be Enmity's Illuminations of Vile Engorgement and Last Days of Humanity's Putrefaction in Progress. And Black Metal Guy, you've heard Enmity, but you haven't heard the LDOH record, am I right?
Yeah, I've probably listened to. Let's see, I've probably listened to all of Illuminations of Vile Engorgement a couple times back in the day when you first showed me them. Last Days of Humanity is more just a thing that you mention sometimes. It's easy to confuse also with the avant deathcore band Humanity's Last Breath, which we did review on the show.
Yeah, very different in style. So, this is an interesting opportunity for me. I'm going to be kind of taking the lead on this episode and investigating these matters with the black metal guy. And, I always like to get your opinions on these sorts of things since it's, relatively outside of your wheelhouse. But I think, I think a kind of commonality that we can identify here with something that we've talked about on the show is the oftentimes on the show, we will talk about certain kinds of black metal as being black metal but not heavy metal. To say that they have really distanced themselves, either intentionally or not, from the, the emphasis on melody, riff-based songwriting, but they have maintained a sort of essence of black metal that goes above and beyond. It is merely the elements that black metal brought to the table, subtracting out the sort of heavy metal core that lies at the center of that. And then, obviously, examples that I could think of that would be, I think the earliest would be Abruptum. I think they're a good example of that.
Iljarn, Blazebirth Hall, Graveland.
Yeah. I think that Graveland, I would argue, has a beating heart of heavy metal in it, but I get where you're coming at.
You've made that case, and it's easier for me to hear now how some of it relates to stuff that was in 80s metal, but I think that by the time you get Thousand Swords, it's been thoroughly digested.
Yeah, that's fair.
Even and the later records are really bombastic in a way that is kind of metal. Mm-hmm. But even that, it doesn't, like, you can tell he's getting it from like Epic Bathory or whatever. But there's no heavy metal that sounds like. Fire Chariot of Destruction is bombastic like a heavy metal record is, but it sounds nothing like it.
Yeah, no, I can see where you're coming from. Yeah. So. And then, of course, obviously, this also extends to stuff that we're not really fans of, but is, also, stuff that we're not fans of, but, like, I don't begrudge, like, Paysage d'Hiver or something.
Or some, like, I guess DSBM. Some of it, right? Like, some of which we like, some of which we don't like. Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually, I randomly decided...
Oh, wait, we're forgetting the most obvious, like fucking Mutilation, right?
Mutilation is a good example.
LLN black metal, basically.
It's funny, I got a random urge the other day to, like, revisit Paysage and, like, give it another shot. So I was listening to, I think, the self-titled record in my car, and my verdict was like, oh, this is okay. I still don't get it, though. It's probably been 8 years since I gave him a shot, and it's like, it's still pretty much what I thought.
Yeah, pretty fine. People keep asking us if we'll review them, and I think the answer is always just like, we'll never harsh your vibe for liking Paysage d'Hiver, but we'll never listen to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to listen to BBH instead. I mean, there's your permanent review of Paysage d'Hiver. This is okay. But, like, Forrest and Branacald exist, so, I mean, that's it. And I know there's people in our Discord that would be disappointed by that verdict, but at this point, it's been enough years that I don't think anything's going to change. So back on track, so I bring up that comparison because this is an idea that is not so easily reflected on the, what we sort of vaguely think of on the show is like the opposite side of the coin, the death metal part of the equation. What is death metal without heavy metal? Well, I think I've kind of made the case, at least in fits and starts, that brutal death metal is frequently, death metal without heavy metal. However, we've also discovered a lot of brutal death stuff that actually is like old school death metal at its heart, just sped up with more technicality and more aggressive timbre. But I think on the show today, we're going to be covering a lot of stuff that is very explicitly death metal without heavy metal. And I would wager just maybe some of the most extreme stuff that's ever come out that can still be, roughly called death metal in some form or fashion. And what's interesting to me is that this can take a lot of different forms. I feel like when black metal moves beyond heavy metal, what it tends to turn into is a kind of ambient music. And I don't say that derisively. I like a lot of that stuff a lot. But largely... Go ahead.
Oh, it becomes something like what, I think one of the defining statements on this sort of vibe you get on that old Anus Death Metal Underground review of Discharge, which describes it as like ambient music, right? Mm-hmm. I think when black metal moves beyond heavy metal, you get some sort of like ambient hardcore music.
Yeah.
Like, or ambient hardcore folk. Something like that, right? Yeah.
Well, so what happens when we take death metal and we remove heavy metal from it? Well, what it turns into is, in some sense, a kind of noise music, but I take a little bit of issue with that characterization, and I'll get into that when we talk about these records in particular. But what it becomes is largely purely timbral music. If you can say that in many cases black metal going beyond heavy metal turns it into almost purely melodic music, death metal going beyond heavy metal becomes purely timbral and rhythmic music.
That's an interesting distinction.
Yeah. I've upon re-listening to a lot of these records, I've been having a great couple days just listening to all this stuff. I'm just I'm just a fox in a hen house here.
I would say the best example for people of like black metal beyond heavy metal being purely melodic is just like Blazebirth Hall, where a lot of the drama you associate with heavy metal song structure, the heavy metal narrative song structure. I think what all these bands get rid of is narrative song structure in the heavy metal style. And like at Blazebirth Hall, that goes away, and rhythmic change, certain kinds of dramatic rhythmic change-ups metal drama goes away, and you end up just with endless streaming melody.
Yeah, or, I can't believe we just skipped past it entirely. I would say that, some of the first senses of that are going to be, Burzum Civislis et Taras and Philosophy.
Yeah.
Which are certainly...
Totally fair.
Yeah, I would say those are, like, no longer black metal as heavy metal at that point.
Yeah, that's ground zero for that. I mean, I also think the other thing I want to say about this, which you could tie to Burzum, is... it's kind of natural to get black metal beyond heavy metal because black metal is born out of a distaste or dissatisfaction with the most heavy metal aspects of death metal, right? Mm-hmm. The perception is, death metal is now the heavy metal bullshit of our time, and we are reacting against that. So even though, you obviously can meaningfully point at, you can point at an early Immortal album or Emperor or Demisteris and be like, these are metal records, clearly. There's already an attempt to reject and overcome some distinctively metal things. So, whereas like a lot of the classic death metal, because it has this kind of, withering technical proficiency, crispness, and visceral heaviosity, complex song structure, and drama, right? The headbangability of classic death metal. All of that is very metal. And so, although you can point to things in the early 90s that were death metal but really weird and maybe not very metal, in some ways it's more of an achievement, I think, to produce death metal that is not heavy metal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think going back, I think that in the case of black metal, going beyond heavy metal was arrived at very deliberately. And I think
very early, yeah.
Yeah, and I think in the death metal context, it's largely been arrived at accidentally. Through just the sheer surplus of stuff, of like technical achievement, speed, note density, technicality that propels it just through, sheer envelope pushing past the boundaries of heavy metal.
That's a great distinction. It's actually it's like pure self-overcoming, pure quantity through pure quality through quantity, right? It's exactly some of like heavy metal excess pursued far enough just stops being metal.
Yeah, and I think that story really begins with brutal death metal. Actually, over the past couple weeks, I've been listening to a ton of Suffocation again, and going back to early Suffocation records, it's one of those cases where it's fascinating how early those records are. They're so much earlier than you think they are. Effigy of the Forgotten is basically contemporary with Blessed Are the Sick. But listening to an album like that, if you listen to it hard, try to imagine a guy from Tampa who's listening to Morbid Angel and Deicide, listening to Suffocation. I think that it would raise some eyebrows. And then, getting a little bit further, my personal favorite record by that band is their third one, Pierced from Within. I was listening to that in the car the other day, and it is shocking just how ugly and withering and dissonant it is, and structurally ambitious. That's a record I'd love to talk about on the show sometime. But even there, and especially with, concurrent things happening in, like, the European gore grind scene around that same era, I think there has been an impulse to sort of make death metal beyond heavy metal, even if it wasn't necessarily recognized as such at the time. Mm-hmm. And with that, happy Mother's Day, folks. Let's listen to the worst music ever made.
How's it going? Connor here from Oncology, and you're listening to Terminus.
Alright guys, it's time for the first, primary review of the night, which is, again, for Enmity's Illuminations of Vile Engorgement, released on Permeated Records in April of 2005. It's wild to think we're just past the 20th anniversary of this album. For those who aren't familiar, Enmity is an impossibly brutal death metal band from Arizona who released a handful of demos stretching back to 96, culminating in their full-length Illuminations of Vile Engorgement in 2005, after which they effectively disappeared. The personnel behind the band, we have their names, but I have seen little to no information about them ever. I believe a couple interviews have been done ever around when they were active in the early to mid 2000s, but largely Enmity is a band that came from nothing and disappeared back into nothing. But not without releasing one extremely important statement. Okay, it bears mentioning, in 2002 they released an EP called Vomit Forth Intestinal Excrement, which is also very good. If you like the full length, you'll probably like that, but it is, just by dint of being earlier, a little bit closer to normal death metal. Many of you listening, if you haven't heard the record, have probably heard of this album, and especially of the absurdly divisive critical reception that it receives. I think that there's actually very few records in metal with a starker black and white contrast in how people see it. On Metal Archives, there's 24 reviews with an average rating of 52%, and I can tell you that those are mostly around 100 or around 0.
Yep. It's crazy. And these reviews go back. Most of the action on this happens years ago, but easily a third, if not a half, are relatively recent. Mm-hmm. Actually, no, that's not true. I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a few from maybe a quarter are from recently. The rest are all pretty old.
It's but if you believe me, if you compare it to other places like Rate Your Music, there's always a couple more people putting their 2 cents in every year. This is a band and a record that has had a tremendously outsized impact on the metal scene in very strange ways. And what began as a completely fringe cult weirdo thing has turned into what I would call something of a brutal death classic. Back closer to when this was released, this was considered a sort of strange novelty thing that very few people within or without brutal death metal took seriously. But now, for serious brutal death guys, this is just seen as a high watermark of absolute extremity that has rarely, if ever, been topped.
I think back in the day, a lot of people, the people who were critical of it, or even kind of amused by it, viewed it as sort of the reductio ad absurdum of brutal death. Right. Mm-hmm. If you hated brutal death metal, this was a great example of what you didn't like about it.
And if you loved it, it was a great example of why you were there for the genre.
Yes.
Yeah. So obviously, I am the sort of relentlessly contrarian person that when I see something on Metal Archives with 24 reviews and an average straight down the middle, perfectly divided between zeros and 100s, I know that this has to be doing something right. And Well, to be fair, I think I originally heard this album in probably 2006, 2007, and it immediately became one of my favorite records of all time. I think I'll get an Enmity tattoo. I think that would be cool. I think this is a case where I might actually get a logo, because I think their logo is extremely cool too.
You should get a knuckle tat, but you're just on your thumb. You should have the T and the Y.
I like that. That's fun. This is one of those moments where the audience really gets to peek inside, like, how weird I actually am. Which is
he's a crazy freak, man. He's a fucking psycho.
I'm insanely twisted, bro. I'm so twisted that when I play Crazy Taxi, it just seems like a regular taxi to me. So I preface that to say that I really have an emotional connection to this album. The black metal guy, having known me for so many years, knows that I have a particular affinity, maybe paradoxically, for these extremely remote, almost deliberately emotionally blank records that, has something to do with, like, growing up and being an extremely depressed kid. I like how there's a police siren in the background while I'm talking about it.
They finally come for you, man.
They found me. So Illuminations of Vile Engorgement was a record like that for me. I would compare it immediately to earlier Mortician stuff, certain Abruptum, Mutilation. There's certain kinds of depression music for me that might not be depression music for other people. And Enmity...
people are recommended to go back and listen to the episode 26. I think we review Pan American and If.
Oh God, we're on blackout drunk and having a fucking meltdown.
There's horrible background noise, and the death metal guy is shit canned. And at the end of the episode, he starts reviewing a DSBM record, but it really turns into him talking about Mortician as DSBM, and it's pretty raw, but it is kind of one of the coolest things we've done.
I look at that and I think not my finest moment, but usually those end up being pretty fine moments. So
that's why that's kind of you kind of, I think when you do stuff like this, you kind of have to take one for the team in that way. I will say also that when he talks about being a depressed teenager or whatever, to this day, the death metal guy is, until he, changed certain things changed in his life, the death metal guy when he was young was by far the most depressed person I've ever met, and has done me irreparable psychological damage, because I figured after meeting him, I was like, well, I don't have depression for years. Right. I mean, he's definitely knows whereof he speaks. He's not. Everyone always is like, oh gosh, I was such an angsty teen. I had such a hard time. This guy was pretty fucked up.
Yeah, and probably because of, or in close relation to, listening to stuff like this constantly.
you didn't make it easier for yourself, but that's
no, certainly not.
That's the extreme metal way.
Yeah, exactly. So with that, I have listened to this record more than I would say the vast majority of people who say they are fans of it have.
Sure, yeah.
It's one thing to listen to this once, it's another thing to listen to it a handful of times. It's something extremely different to have listened to this, 100 times, which I probably have. So where do we begin? Okay, so Enmity is on its face a brutal death metal band. However, when we say that, you have to throw out a ton of the things that you associate with brutal death metal. There is technicality, but it is largely indecipherable. There are riffs, but you cannot hear them in a traditional sense. The guitar on this recording is so down-tuned and so distorted that it is a purely timbral instrument. We're not talking about occluded distortion from recording. We're talking about a guitar tone where the tone itself has been siphoned out of it to the point where, while you can tell the pitch is moving up and down in some sort of sequence, you cannot glean any melodic information from it. Alongside this is a suitably putrid and sort of endlessly ranting vocal performance that I think is at least 2 tracks constantly. I am sure that there are absolutely no lyrics here. Sort of endlessly slurring as another layer of timbre and distortion over the whole thing. And underneath that, what I assume is a drum machine playing either extremely fast blast beats or strange lurching slams. Structurally, this is not incoherent, but it is extremely difficult to wrap your brain around because the main thing that would allow you to remember it, melodic information, is completely absent on this record. So what this ends up feeling like, to a large degree, to me, is a sort of extreme avant-garde industrial death metal. There is a tremendous coldness and remoteness and disconnect in this. It is, if we talk, you often talk about, not wanting humanity in your extreme metal. Enmity is damn near the most inhuman thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Do you think that relatively captures it? Actually, let's talk about when you heard it, because I'm very curious, as to someone coming from a very different kind of set of musical parameters, what your initial impressions are.
Yeah, industrial is right. I mean, it really, and I remember the sort of, it's hollow beyond hollow, right? You can make a hollow guitar tone in black metal. You scoop out the middle, you remove a lot of the lows. You can make something that sounds hollow but still has some kind of ringing tonal richness to it, or even if it doesn't sound, even if it's more just bleak and sterile, it has information to it. As you were saying, the lack of there's the continual suggestion of melody without there being melody in this, right? Of you could hear that the pitch is varying, but in a way that doesn't really add up to anything, is really impressive. I mean, in some sense, us talking at the beginning was already what I thought of it when I first heard it. You know what I mean? We've been talking about this record forever, and so I mean, I'm sure my immediate comparison was oh, this is the deliberate monotony of the most extreme D-beat stuff, or Iljarn, or whatever. I mean, at the time, one of the most obnoxious records I've ever listened to still, I think, is Malveillance's Just Fuck Off.
That's so good.
Yeah, it's easily the hard. Everyone talking about black D-beat. This is easily the hardest black D-beat record ever, and it's somehow it's more dissonant than Discharge, to the point where it is complete melodic nonsense a lot of the time. But there's still a riffiness to it, which is important. But if you carried that much further, you would get something like this, which you get some of the aggression or physicality of the riff without any of the energy that comes, without any of the energy or enduring value that comes from tone. And when you're describing the sheer lack of memorability about this, it's an interesting idea, right? It almost makes experiencing this different from experiencing music. But yeah, the industrial quality was something that, you notice obviously, because they're not trying to hide the drum machine. They're not trying to hide the way they've processed the guitars or the vocals. It's all part of the method in a way that's way better than when people try to sneak that shit in. So yeah, I liked it, and I thought there was something viscerally satisfying and heavy about just the endless...
Just the square wave.
yeah, the square wave the square wave hits hard, man. I mean, there is it is very, very heavy, and if you like a certain kind of brutal minimalist body music, this should be enjoyable.
Yeah.
But it is deeply... Cold isn't the right word because it's not natural. It's empty.
It is extremely empty. It is... Well, I'll compare it to some things in a moment. Let's listen to a sample. So, just so you guys know, I'm going to do, like, a sample less than we typically would on these, because the records that we were talking about are largely, if you've heard a couple minutes, you've heard the whole record, and, it probably doesn't require me to disclaim that, but obviously that's nothing against these records. This is just how they are structured. But first off, let's listen to Charred, Mutilated, Dislimbed, the second track off the record. I want to listen to that. So, initially I was going to just sample off the beginning of the record, Bloated Slabs, but I think that a lot of people have probably heard the first minute of Bloated Slabs, and they've, concluded everything that they wanted to about this record. So, let's go to a song that isn't mentioned, and let's start to develop the idea that this is literally what this album is made of. Every time I hear this band, I am taken aback by just what it is.
Jun 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 jun.
The relationship to time is insane.
Yeah. I would actually say it's catchier than I remember.
Yeah,
and that kind of was my initial impression about it too, actually. So maybe not than I remember, but to try to communicate to people, you obviously have to explain how not riffy it is. But, like, really, if you see the riff from a hardcore perspective, less as a unit of melodic information and more as a way of converting pitch variation to aggression, right? In the sort of, in the sort of more punk-based tradition, this really is riffy. You won't really be able to remember one from one exactly, but that has like 5 discernible, differentiated moments that do something different, that are very heavy, and where you really can latch onto them in the moment. And I wouldn't be surprised if listening back to this, a couple of those parts you actually could latch onto.
Yeah, like a lot of the slam parts, well, big quotes around that, because they don't work like slams. They're not mosh moments. The slow parts are pretty memorable. And so there's a few things I want to point out quickly. One is something that you said a while back, which was we were talking about music, especially black metal, with quote-unquote bad production or inaudible riffs. You pointed out that you can tell the difference when the riffs are good and the riffs are bad. Like, having the bad production and the cool timbral thing going on does not excuse you from having good riffs, even if you can't hear them. There is something that seeps into the music. Something
you can see a body in the mist.
Yes. So it's like, you can tell that there's something to these riffs, even if we're not really able to understand them melodically. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was just. It's also worth repeating. Well, you go on. We'll talk about the rhythm stuff, I'm sure. Go on.
Well, I was also going to say that, like, alongside that, sort of relating to the idea of, like, whether this is nonsense or whether this is meaningful music. I mean, like, obviously it's meaningful music. Give me a fucking break. But to that point, this is not improvisational. These are structured songs. The way that song arcs back into that strange slam part again, with rhythmic variation moving into it, indicates that. The fact that the drum machine is not copied and pasted, the fact that there's weird off-time fills happening that are unique on every repetition, indicates that there's serious effort put into it. This was a meaningful project. There is intent behind this. This is not the equivalent of sort of improvisational harsh noise stuff. There's something more deliberate going on.
I mean, and there are people in the comments comparing it to Incinerated. Look, Incinerated is cool and all, but this is way heavier.
Yeah.
In part because there is that definition to it.
And Incinerated is hyper-technical, essentially free jazz using brutal death metal parts. This is after something completely different. This is a death metal band, first and foremost.
Yeah. I mean, so the way, on that first slowdown, the way the drum machine keeps cutting across the riff in different ways is crazy. I can't even begin to describe what they're doing there rhythmically, but it's just much freer than anything that regular death metal or black metal bands do. And you can really hear that if black metal, if non-metal black metal is this purification towards melody, the idea that death metal is much more invested in rhythm than black metal is, here it's purification towards rhythm and timbre for sure. And a big part of what makes the riffs different, right, when they're so chromatic, is the rhythms. This is a pretty cool album, man. I still really like it.
Yeah, I think that, so rhythmically, a very interesting thing that's not mentioned a lot is that, so at first blush, Enmity sounds like they are trading in these sort of like resolute hammering palm muted 16th note runs that we'd hear in, and any given number of brutal death metal bands like, Exterminated, for something we had on the show that I really like.
Yes.
Yeah. But actually, Enmity does a lot more stop-start stuff. There's strange breaks in the middle of those runs of just like sudden mutes that don't seem to make sense. But as you said, they cut across bar formations in a really fascinating way. I have a different theory every time I listen to this album about like how it was done, like how it was executed. And I'll have to call back to an older episode. I think this was episode 90 something. It was with me and Hyper Shaman. It was the first one where you weren't there, and me and him were reviewing some brutal death records. And we covered the Intestinal Engorgement record, which is a band that I can't recall. I believe they're from possibly Ecuador or maybe somewhere in Central America, and they are clearly an Enmity worship project. And we had a working theory that how those guys had made that record was by sort of cutting, recording sections of music, maybe 10 seconds at a time, just a massive number of those, and cutting and pasting them almost at random next to each other. Because it's impossible to tell, one part from another, essentially. And we thought that sort of working backwards, perhaps that's how Enmity had been done. At this point, I don't think that's what happened. That might be...
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, that might be Intestinal Engorgement, but I don't think that's Enmity. What I do think is possible is that Enmity recorded this album on guitars first to a click track and then layered the drum machine over that. Because
you're really using the drums to introduce variation.
Yeah, because I don't because for instance in that slow slam part with the weird off-time drumming, I just don't think it's feasible to say that they recorded to those drums. I feel like the drums were put in after, and they figured out the bizarre ways that it could cut across the riff sort of on the fly.
Yeah. I think it would be hard to do it any other way.
Yeah, it's almost uncountable.
And yes, what you were saying about the kind of rhythmic change-ups inside the chug trem runs. The important thing is that they're, again, it goes back to what makes really great bands: picking control. Mm-hmm. And inflection. There are all these sort of stutters and extra insertions and deletions in these 16th note runs, but it doesn't slow them down. It doesn't give them the sort of hiccupy stop-start feeling of certain tech stuff. Mm-hmm. Because it's being played so fucking fast in the first place.
So fast, and usually with like an omnipresent steady blast beat.
Yes, the blast beat helps carry the momentum too. So it's so it adds, again, some of the information in these riffs that, like, a lot of their contouring is coming from rhythm even more than melody. It's just like, this is the one where it goes rather than, go.
And it's especially impressive because now I'm listening to this maybe for the first time ever on these like pretty high-end headphones. Well, for me, high ends, they're mid-range for real people.
No, same. I hear a lot on these.
And what's interesting is listening to that guitar tone very carefully, I'm starting to pull out that perhaps one of the explanations for just how bizarre the timbre is, again, sort of a working theory. I think that these guitars were down-tuned not really to a tuning, just to the lowest pitch possible with an adequate level of vibration to sound the notes. I think that what you're hearing is strings that are barely able to vibrate at this point that are being massively overdriven in the production through just pedals. Which is why it has that, like, clanking clicking tone to it. It's almost like listening to corn bass or something, you know. But as a result, like it's so hard for the melody to even come out, because I'm guessing that this is tuned. Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to tell with the timbre, but I'm just from experience, I'm guessing this is at the E octave, possibly lower, if that's even possible, you know? Baritone guitars, maybe? I'm not sure. But clearly these are not being played like a guitar typically is.
So in a way, you're saying that like, people often use the word detuned, which I assume means like an alternate tuning.
Well,
like,
they're severe.
Drop D. These are just literally detuned.
Yeah, I'm not sure that these guitars are in A tuning, so to speak.
Right, they're in drop fuck.
They're just really low. They're just as low as they could go. You know, physically. And possibly lower. I think Enmity has a gravity well around them that can actually bend the laws of physics. So, let's listen to another sample. This one off the title track, Illuminations of Vile Engorgement. I selected this one. This is interesting. This is one of perhaps the only occasion on the record where a straight tremolo riff is actually played. And with this timbre, the result is fucking wild. Dude, the sound of that trem riff could be something you find on a fucking Coil record.
Oh, yeah. And it's, a big part of what makes it is the bass drum. I feel like, usually on a Brutal Death record, or really a lot of extreme metal records, the bass drum is really an afterthought to the snare and whatever's going on the snare and the cymbals and toms. Like, the bass drum is almost more, in really crazy blasting, the bass drum is almost more like an implied presence. Mm-hmm. Like, it's almost the absence between the snare hits. Or just a way of, depending on how the rhythm is being done, a little extra bump to the snare hit. This is, it's like almost, the snare is almost a part of the trem riff there. And every once in a while, you get a really unhinged snare riff that just kind of sounds like the trumpet of the Last Judgment. I feel like that's a pretty good candidate.
Yeah,
it's like, you know, that's just really cool. I don't really know what else to say about it, but it's recognizably a trem riff, and it sounds, you can't hum it.
It's like you can. it's so hard to tell when you listen to this record whether you're hearing things correctly or if it's like overtones playing tricks on your brain.
Yes, yeah.
Because that trem riff sounds like a crazy series of like descending pull-offs to me, like do, 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 like really chromatic pull-offs, but who knows? I mean, these strings are vibrating at such a bizarre frequency, it could be literally anything. That's just like the impression that I get. So yeah, another thing that I wanted to talk about, something that we tend not to talk about a lot, especially with brutal death records, is something to do with aesthetics. Ever since I first heard this record, I've been standing by the idea that there's something like extremely smart and sophisticated and high art about this record.
Yeah.
And I think that bears out in the sheer abstraction of its presentation, not just the musical content with the insane timbres, but the album art. I don't think I've seen anyone mention it. The album art is fucking insane.
Yeah, for years, just from JPEG images seen from a distance, I'd kind of just thought it was like a cave with some damned souls in it. But the real star of the show is on the right.
The tube monster?
The tube monster.
How do we even describe what's going on? There's some sort of fleshy creature that is largely an enormous tube that seems to be disgorging or engorging bloodied corpses, and it has spider limbs and some horrible mouth cavity at the top that might be getting torn open.
The mouth is like a rip in it, and okay, I think it's eating at that end, because it's got hands feeding it the corpses of the damned at the top. I think it's sort of feeding itself struggling human bodies, or fragments of them. And its mouth is also like its rib cage. And then we go down, and there's just this tube coming out of it. And what's disturbing about the tube is how weak it is. It's a complete just sack flap of flesh that doesn't support itself, even though it's got spider legs coming off it. And it's just sort of like shit coming people out of itself. It's like a cloaca but it's like a bag.
Yeah, there's something loose and frail about it. And then there's just what appears to be the trunk of a tree or an enormous stalactite that might be made of bones or cobwebs or something. And it's also bleary and hard to understand. It really reminds me of those very early AI images like Google Deep Dream.
The interesting ones.
Yeah, where it would be, from a distance, it would look like a table covered in various household objects, but then you would look at it and realize you couldn't actually identify anything in it. There's something similar going on.
Right, like the riffs. Right?
Yes, like the riffs here.
Yes, it has the inscrutability, or the sort of impenetrable nature of a lot of this stuff. Is there any note on who did the cover? Because
I just looked it up. It's a guy named Andy Dicochea. And he has only done the art for some Enmity records and a record by a band called Genocost, where and the Genocost seems to be sort of kind of crude but kind of cool 3D cut and paste stuff, where there's an evil pope with a decapitated head and a big castle behind him with octopus tentacles coming out of it.
Oh, and this is totally different.
Yeah, it's so weird.
This seems like it's AI. This seems like it's digital art.
Except
also.
This is 2012. Yeah, this is definitely digital.
Yeah, but the other thing is not. The other thing looks like, when you zoom in on the cover of Illuminations, it really is you would assume it's kind of the standard. You'd assume it's a good, interesting version of the usual sort of Lovecraft, Hieronymus Bosch type cover, which it is, but it also, the way the indistinctness of it and the suggestion of it is a lot, and the blurry outlines of the objects, it's a lot like Francis Bacon.
It is, but I think there's also a possibility that this is a sort of like mixed media combination of like hand-drawn stuff, and like maybe the cave could be like a 3D render or something, you know?
Sure, it could be digital. All I'm trying to say is that it really looks like a frame. It has some of the difficult to achieve qualities of the weird altered space and sort of non-corporeal bodies of like a Francis Bacon painting.
Yeah,
it's a pretty sophisticated piece of art by that you would that obviously has been totally overlooked.
Yeah. So I don't know, man. There's something about the presentation of this record, even just some of the song. I mean, like Illuminations of Vile Engorgement. Like it doesn't. It purely abstract, really doesn't mean anything. Some of the song titles, you know, opening with Bloated Slabs, like it doesn't even, it doesn't even have like a fathomable connotation. Like it's so bizarre and open to interpretation. There's something like fleshy and Lovecraftian or Cronenbergian about it, but also decidedly death metal in a traditional sense. But it's, you know, the violence of some of the titles, though, seems like unmoored, which is something that I'll talk about in the next review also. It's a, you know, if brutal death metal largely operates within hideous modernity, this seems to operate like in a different dimension. You know, this is... What is happening on this album is not taking place on Earth, as far as I can tell.
No, I think a word that's overused for this kind of music, like, Enmity does actually sound demonic. In the way that, like, not just in the sense of, like, the devil is a guy who, like, works out a lot. But it sounds demonic in the sense of, people's descriptions of weird paranormal events. You know, it sounds demonic in a way that's a lot more unnerving, because it sounds like a thing that you might just accidentally pick up on your radio sometime. You have stumbled into places you were not meant to go. Yes. Oh wait, I shouldn't be here. I have to leave.
Yeah, except you can't. You're here now forever.
Right.
And then if you wanted, like, one last piece of proof that there was something going on here, something very deliberate and something very smart, all you have to do is go to the final track, Severe Lacerations. And this is how you can tell that many of the people who comment on this record online have never actually listened to the whole thing. Because this is the secret that's tucked away at the end. After, 30 plus minutes of this sort of numbing, unbelievably harsh, deliberately monotonous, purely timbral music, there is this beautiful, evocative flamenco piece at the end. That's,
I had no idea this was there.
Yeah, man. And touched up with these, subtle electronic effects in the background. as though to say, you made it to the end, here's the evidence that there's something here. That these are remarkably sophisticated guys, and obviously incredibly talented musicians, who are choosing deliberately to operate in this mode. Not for any lack of ability, but because they had something to express. And I think that it's a wonderful inside joke on all the people who think that this is just nothing more than absurd extremity. Alright guys, we are back with the second review of the night, which will be a look at the third record by Last Days of Humanity, titled Putrefaction in Progress, released in 2006 on Bones Brigade Records. Is it safe to assume that you have probably accidentally heard LDOH at one point but recall nothing of it?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, okay. So, for those of you who... So, Gorgrind barely exists anymore. We're in a very strange time for the genre where people are making Gorgrind records, but nobody seems to really care. It has become a sort of hyper-niche thing within European extreme metal circles. There's a handful of US bands and bands from other countries and regions that are putting stuff out, but it has been a long time since a particularly significant gore grind record came out that was not released by Lymphatic Phlegm within the past few years. But before that, Last Days of Humanity for several years really reigned supreme as the biggest and baddest and most important of the gore grind bands. And their career had an interesting trajectory. They began in 1989, and I believe in that formation they were more of a pure noisecore band in the anal cunt style. If I recall correctly, the initial formation was like just 2 vocalists and a drummer. Just like 2 vocalists with insane distortion.
Well, that's yeah.
And a drummer playing
basically a
blast
noise
beats.
band.
Yeah. But with blast beats, which is cooler than most noise bands. Over time, they got more and more involved in the metal scene until eventually sort of emerging as a full-fledged gore grind band. The first record, The Sound of Rancid Juices Sloshing Around Your Coffin, is a cool album, but it's mostly carcass worship, so your mileage will vary basically as depending on how into carcass you are. Their second album, Hymns of Indigestible Separation, was a big deal, extraordinarily influential for gore grind as a whole, and is probably to a large degree their most beloved record. In between all of this, of course, there's 10 billion splits and everything, but let's just keep it to the highlights. Then there was an EP, a short one called In Advanced Hemorrhaging or Hemorrhagic Conditions, and people started to think that maybe something was up when that was released. Because it was more aggressive, a lot more aggressive, like really, really, really aggressive. And it kind of turned out that ended up in style being a teaser for their third and at the time final full-length record, Putrefaction in Progress. This is one of my favorite albums of all time, like bar none. Enmity, I've listened to a ton, but it's kind of a mood piece for me. Putrefaction in Progress I can put on literally at any time, and it's just like the first time I listened to it. Coming off the heels of Hymns of Indigestible Separation, I believe the fan base expected more of the same. Still very fast and aggressive and brutal gore grind, but with a lot more nods to groove, coherent carcass-inspired riffing, just more traditional quote-unquote heavy metal. Putrefaction in Progress was decidedly not that. Gore noise as a concept had existed prior to Putrefaction in Progress, but mostly relegated to very obscure, just demo-level projects that largely were not listened to at the time and only got unearthed in any sort of wider appreciation many years later. Putrefaction in Progress, though, really kind of launched that as a meaningful style. Not just this album, but the whole host of side projects that the members of LDOH would sort of like turn into the center of their musical attention after this band dissolved. Stuff like Anal Penetration, Urine Festival, Biocyst, stuff like that. And those are all extremely cool projects. I honestly think the LDOH side projects are some of the best stuff that Gore Noise ever produced. But Putrefaction in Progress stands alone. It is a... Well, it sounded like you wanted to say something. So
yeah, so I might have missed something you already said, or I might be getting ahead of things. But when they recorded this one, they had already... No, this has to be... They had already introduced a guitar or
yes,
bass.
Yes, they were a full rock and roll band lineup.
With still 2 vocalists?
No, I think it was just 1 vocalist at this point.
Okay.
Yeah. I can't remember. So that's a really early formation, that pure noisecore one. That's in 89. I think pretty rapidly they started moving into like rock instruments.
Right.
I think they'd always been into that. These were not like art guys. They were
Right, they were not noise people.
Yeah, they were metal punks who saw noisecore as, like, a cool, annoying thing to do. You know?
That'd be a great t-shirt. Noisecore is a cool, annoying thing to
do. Although it's funny that you bring this up, because it really connects to... I had talked about wanting to get to this in the Enmity review, but you brought up a good point. These are not noise people. Many people talk about Putrefaction in Progress being a highlight and being functioning like a harsh noise record. And this is true to a degree. But I've also come to conclude that, like, pure noise people do not work well in band formations like this. You really want people from metal and punk and, if we can use an absurd sort of term that will make sense even if it's wrong, extreme rock and roll people. You know?
People who are interested in, like, aggressive guitar music.
Yeah, you don't want people who are primarily into contact mics. And and I guess my scalding hot take that I've kind of, like, come to realize is, like, all the cool noise people are metalheads also. Like,
right, sure.
Pure noise people that aren't into other extreme music are generally not cool, which is probably why I'm also, like, primarily into power electronics, because all those people are metalheads. You know? Right. Oh, and also, it's sort of tangentially related, but people are saying, oh, you know, death metal guy, you said this was going to be, you know, death metal getting into noise territory, but this is a gore grind band. Gore grind is a subgenre of death metal. There's another hot take for you. It's not really grindcore. It is sort of grindcore song formatting with death metal riffing as a core idea, and I would say more tellingly, this might be unfair, but there's never been a guy who is into gore grind who is not also into death metal. There are guys who are into grindcore who are not into death metal.
Yeah, not really into death metal. Or very selectively into death metal.
Yeah, but gore grind guys, or even gore noise guys, you know?
That's not what I would expect. That is interesting. I would have thought that gore grind, yeah, I wouldn't have associated gore grind riffing with being more death metal than grindcore. But I guess if you think about, like, you know what? I don't know gore grind very well, so we should listen to it.
well, hold on, because gore grind riffing is not what you will get on this album. I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so Putrefaction in Progress lands like a nuke in the scene because, one, I believe it was like shortly after that the band broke up. I believe they had planned to break up as they recorded this, because my pet theory is that they thought this was their definitive statement as a band.
Right.
And it was. In recent years, Last Days of Humanity has gotten back together. They were just doing a lot of live shows. They did a new record in 2021. It's good, but it recedes back into the territory of their second album. And they're never going to touch this again. And I think they accept that. They're never going to be able to top this. Putrefaction in Progress is the most aggressive thing I've ever heard. I think bar none. It's the most, in terms of, like, there's things that are heavier or more quote-unquote brutal, but in terms of sheer ferocity, I don't think anything touches this album. And actually, you know, it's one thing with Enmity to give the preamble, but in this case, let's jump into a sample so you can get oriented, since you're not familiar with this. So let's listen to 3 songs very quickly.
Okay.
This is the first minute and a half of the record. These are the tracks Covered with Feces for Decoration, Visible Stains, Slashes, and Marks of Self-Disgust, and Sewing Up the Abdominal Rupture for the Successive Acts of Degradation. Let's fucking go.
it's pretty aggressive.
Yeah, they seem a little mad.
Yeah.
So, like Enmity, upon your first time hearing this, especially if you're younger, I mean, you know where this is going, but if you're like me and you're 15 when you first hear this, or, well, actually, no, this was released in 2006, so I'd have to be at least 16, there comes that moment where you realize this is all of it.
Right.
It is 25 minutes of this continuously, without break, without discernible riff, without meaningful song structures, and a truly endless series of blast beats and undifferentiated micro songs, with the most redlined production and the most extreme playing I had ever heard up to that point. And this is still some of the most extreme playing I've ever heard. It is... If Enmity is the sort of cold and remote side of the equation, Last Days of Humanity is the white-hot sort of animalistic rage on the other end.
Yeah, rabid and murderous. Yeah.
So, what are your initial impressions? Because you've certainly like heard tale of this record, right?
Well, it grinds.
It grinds pretty hard.
Yeah. I think I was there mostly trying to listen to the guitar/bass tone. Mm-hmm. And the stupid thought I had was that every riff kind of resolves into where, like, Enmity is sliding around by half steps constantly, or like less than half steps, semitones or something. This is every riff on this sounds like 1970 by the Stooges. They just all sound like one minor third. It's just all like
I think it's extremely plausible to suggest these guys probably love the Stooges. I think these are guys who are very serious about extreme music broadly.
Right. And you were saying sociologically they are punks.
Both metal punks.
Yeah.
They're they're Dutch, what? So it's like I don't think that the lines were quite as defined over there.
Sure, yeah, and you've said that. I mean, yeah, with the sort of European gore grind scene in general, you've said that about the Czechs too. It's like it's very punk and very metal, and doesn't necessarily answer American versions of either of those things.
Yeah,
right. It's so I mean, it's kind of like a lot of the stuff on what's our Self-Made God, right?
Yeah.
You know,
I always forget about Self-Made God, and they're always one of the coolest labels ever.
What a great record label.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. So maybe there is maybe there's more of an actual relationship to the Stooges, but basically, I also kind of wonder, just like, if you play fast enough and loud enough, do you come out the other side? No matter what notes they're actually playing, does it just sort of eventually resolve into 1970 by the Stooges?
Possibly.
You know what I mean? Like, if this is the most aggressive extreme music record ever, maybe it just sort of, like, they're actually playing completely different notes, but somehow what comes out the other side is exactly the same as the first.
Yeah, well,
not exactly the same, of course, but there's been a full, what we're hearing here is like a complete revolution of the cycle.
Well, what I think you do get at something very interesting, which is, this is, in a sense to me, located 100% within death metal. In that, like, yes, clearly these guys listen to a ton of extreme punk, but this is just not in any way connected to punk. That being said, this is death metal without heavy metal, but I can draw the line in some sense from Discharge to this very directly. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's more. I mean, the anti-music thing here is. I mean, I don't know. I think you could call it a kind of punk music. It just doesn't have the things that we consider annoying about punk as a scene, or a sort of. Yeah, like it's after the same thing as the best and most unhinged punk. Right, we're not comparing it to Nausea or comparing Crass. We're comparing it to the Stooges and Discharge, to the punk that is most relevant to extreme metal. I mean, I guess timbre, in terms of the timbre and stuff, like the tone is very death metal. The sheer warmth of the instruments, but like, I mean. I don't know, right? Like, you can hear Napalm Death, and you can hear Scum and say that's also a punk record, right?
Yeah. It's a punk. It's if you have a punk record that removes all the shit that sucks about punk, is it still a punk record? You know, like, you know what I mean? It's like I think you are more sympathetic to punk than I am, but even you have things that you like categorically kind of dislike about punk, but you accept that they are part and parcel of it. Like, if you extract all those things, aren't you just remaining with the cool stuff that went to metal? Is it like, didn't I say, I said this forever ago, but it's like, we don't need to listen to punk anymore. It's like black and death metal took everything good out of that. You can just listen to those genres now.
Well, I do think the raggedness of this and the rifflessness of this just has something to do with punk. It just, or it like is, it's more intelligible in punk terms than in metal terms.
That's fair. Yeah.
Like, that's what I'm... Okay, like, Enmity, we can compare it to things like Discharge or whatever, but it's strictly kind of by analogy, right? Because it's so remote and cold. But this is sort of frenzied and rabid and kind of unclean and minimal, and it just... we're sort of taking death metal out of heavy metal, but here I think there's much more of a convergence with just, with like the basic musical values of not hardcore maybe, but punk in general. However, I did have a thought the other day that you would appreciate, I think, that like maybe the difference between punk and other forms of music that are very sonically similar is just that those other forms of music don't like, what's the difference between like, I was always puzzled as to why AC/DC is not considered a punk band. And then I thought of it. It's like, oh yeah, AC/DC don't position themselves as losers.
You're right. You can't be punk and be a winner. Well, so
right.
Actually, actually...
But Last Days of Humanity do position... Like, this is pretty wretched music.
Yeah.
In a way that's very similar to crust punk and dissimilar from death metal.
Yeah, well, okay, so... You actually kind of converge onto a serious thought that I have, which is, like, a distinguishing element of this from punk is that, like, punk, even very good punk, and this is going to be kind of bong-rippy and abstract, so forgive me, even very good punk is positioned within a kind of social space. It is always in dialogue with and interacting with society, people.
Oh,
stuff like
I hear what you mean. You're saying this is too metaphysical to be punk.
This is divorced from everything. It is only related to people in the sense of sheer like fleshy physicality. Like, you can even see that in, again, something similar to Enmity, the absolutely insane song titles on this that are, like, gore grind song titles, but, like, not even in reality anymore, you know?
I think that's a fair point, and in order to, like, disagree with you, I would just have to flag the aspects of the very best punk bands that make them not like punk.
Amoebics.
Right? Yeah. Or right. Like, I mean, the Stooges is pretty like not about society, although or Discharge, right, is ostensibly about society, but accidentally not. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think, in order to say that this connects to all that stuff, what I'm really saying is it connects to this more fundamental extreme music substratum of the best punk music.
Yeah.
So that's fair.
Yeah.
This is like the sheer sort of gleeful obsession with slaughter and decay here is just this ain't mincecore.
Well, it's also like what I find fascinating is like that metaphysical quality, and again, going back to those song titles, congenital interior defects, preservation of headless carry-on, allowing the carvings for mutual compassion, just bizarre, like violence, extreme gore and violence, but like unmoored from anything you can connect. They're not like serial killer fantasies. It's like they exist in a dimension where this is just everything. It's just a dimension of pure blood and suffering,
Right, and they're tapped into a certain substratum. I think we've talked about this before, that there's a certain substratum of reality where this is everything.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Right, looked at if we isolate a certain plane of existence, or we look at everything through one optic, this just is everything.
Yeah, this nightmare landscape of suffering.
They're presenting a coherent interpretation of part of the world. And that interest in metaphysical insight is very different, right? There obviously is also no interest in changing this part of the world.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that got people so off guard when this album came out, is because, like, LDOH is a band that was always very extreme, but there was, like most Euro gore grind, a certain party vibe to it. There is a fun, there is groove, there is headbanging riffs. This is like dissociated from it.
Yeah, this is not fun, and on those terms, I hear what you mean, that this is not gore grind.
Yeah, and this is not punk. Yeah.
No, sorry, I said not fun.
Yeah.
There's a glee to gore grind. It's supposed to be fun. This music is, I guess it's fun in the sense that we find extreme high energy fun, or that you can listen to this while kind of like laughing madly. But like, it's not fun music. It's in no way structured around dopamine hits or
no
catchy parts or dancing. There's none of the sort of like pornographic element you get in a lot of gore grind. It's there's nothing tittillating here.
Yeah, it's just it's monotonous, and as some people like on Rate Your Music point out in reviews, what I find interesting is people describe Enmity in this way, which is kind of true, but it doesn't really bear out in my experience. There's something extremely meditative about this record. This is a kind of ambient music.
Yeah, I think I hear Enmity. Enmity is solemn.
Yeah, but I think
Enmity is solemn in a
but
way.
there's variation. There's really things to follow in
I see
Enmity.
What you mean. Right, there's like here, whereas here this is just a continuum.
Yes, this is just a continuum. To emphasize that, let's listen to 3 more songs. Let's listen to Carnivorous Nausea, Slithered Limbs, Adorable Congestion of Body Remnants, and Gradually Cut Up Under a Series of Light Sedations. a few kind of more technical things that I want to point out for what makes this so remarkable. One, the vocals. There's plenty of, like, wet slurring sounds, but the primary thing you're hearing is, like, an insane roar. Like, pitch-shifted and distorted, but hot and loud and exhaled. Like, screaming, but pitch-shifted into, like, a normal speaking, tone. Which is fascinating.
I like that about it.
Oh, it's insane.
Continuous roar of rage.
Yeah. It's incredibly powerful. After that, something that I invariably always point out on stuff like this, like, especially, for instance, when I talk about, like, mortician or fluids, for those bands, the samples are parts of the songs, you cannot remove them, same with Torso Fuck. Here, the silence between the songs is part of the overwhelming song that is occurring. The little drum fills that announce the songs are crucial parts of the songs. This is really something that has to be taken as an entire pill. There is there's an agglutinative effect of all the micro songs stuck together, which I actually compare in my notes to, like, a weight that is generated in the same way that Funeral Doom albums will get it through massive repetition over long scales of time.
I was actually just going to mention a Funeral Doom.
Yeah.
One thing that makes this more meditative than Enmity is that it stops. Mm-hmm. Even like within the song, there were those moments of sort of like whole note, just whole note chords, sustained chords with a couple drum hits. That has kind of the Funeral Doom, Torture Doom, sort of massive weight in vast spaces feeling to it.
Yeah, and like in those kinds of bands, it's usually just like half step up, half step down. Just
sure.
Yeah, horrible chromatic stuff.
And it's that has a sort of meditative gong chiming in space, coil how to destroy angels quality to it, for sure.
Yeah. And the last thing that really bears mentioning, because I think that it's what the band is about, is the drum performance. Or what the album is about, rather. This is, perhaps more than any other record I've ever heard, an album about the blast beat. Not even the blast beat as, like, primary organizing rhythm, but, like, primary musical feature. The drums are extremely loud and secretly very well produced on this. Riffs don't change, cymbals change over the blast beat. The snare has been extremely carefully recorded. It's pingy and trashy, but there's an incredible, like, tonal body to it. The drums are the center of this record in a way that I've never really heard them before on a gore grind album, which are, secretly pretty much always about riffs and vocals. Here, that blast beat it's the entire principle. It is this album. And nothing proves that better than the final track on the album, which is legendary for a reason. If you've heard anything from LDOH, you've probably heard part of this, because you can show this to people who don't listen to extreme music, and for 10 seconds they'll laugh, and for another 10 they'll smile, and then they'll start to look real concerned, and they'll start to get it. And they might get it better than people that actually listen to extreme music. and I think that really, I love the micro song format. I think that it's really cool, and I think they use it to a tremendous effect, but the effect of listening to that for minutes at a time on the final track.
Yeah.
This
is awesome.
It's unbelievable. The sheer weight of it. Listening to that blast beat continue completely unmitigated. The infinite quality of it is unbelievable. The first time I heard this was one of those revelatory musical experiences. If we talk about black metal having the infinite riff, this is an infinite riff by not being a riff at all. It's
the riff is the blast beat.
Yes, the riff is the blast beat. And then when you listen to it in a multi-minute format, you get to really hear those drums. You get to hear the excitement of shifting from a crash cymbal to a ride.
Or from the ping snare, the trash can snare, to a different snare.
Yeah, I think there's 2 snares on this song.
That's so sick. I mean, I love this. I understand that they literally couldn't make the record just of this, because the only tool for variation they have is basically like pauses and slight change-ups. So I get that they could have made a 25-minute record just of this, but I get why they didn't. But this is just hands down the best thing, and it you know what it does? It doesn't lose any energy by repetition, even though there's not any sort of the usual sort of like melodic material to intensify. This loses nothing by repetition. It only accumulates weight and aggression. And the effect of listening to this, to listen to this properly, you just have to stand with, your fists in the air shouting or whatever. The listening effect is a lot like listening to like Nitberg or Sternatus or something, right? Just sort of maximum tension of the will yelling on a mountaintop. So somehow this last track is extremely epic.
Alright guys, so hopefully you enjoyed those looks at 2 of just my favorite records of all time. But as a little added bonus, I didn't think that there were other records that made a ton of sense to compare directly to those 2. Even now, 20 years past their releases, they still really stand alone. But there are other things that I would describe as sort of brutal death connecting with noise music that I think are really cool, and probably none of which the black metal guy has heard of, and I thought it would be fun to show them off to you listeners, since a lot of them are pretty obscure, and just get some initial reactions from the black metal guy.
We've finally sunk to doing reaction content.
We're doing reaction. Okay, the first one, this is Dark Side of the Moon. Oh god.
Yeah. just so as we listen to this, imagine me just straight soy jacking it.
Yeah, it's like black metal guy reacts to Enmity. Yeah. Okay, so first off is a Russian band called Kopro-Baptized Cunt Hunter. So this is a really cool band that I've loved for a long time. I think they only have one full-length record. I think they recently released a relatively new EP. Let me confirm that on Metal Archives real quick. So they put out an EP in 2017. They did one full-length record called Failure Prosthesis in 2010, released on Coyote Records. This is kind of a cult thing. It's a short album. It's not even 22 minutes long. But I think it's been picking up steam in recent years as more and more people have been getting into the, like, sincerely avant-garde edge of brutal death metal. Awesome album art, bizarre, sort of like childish horror drawing. I really love that to death. The vibe is just extremely unusual. So I just want to show you real quick. We'll listen to a whole song because it's less than a minute long. This is the second track on Failure Prosthesis, titled Copro Heating Reactor. So I really like to think of these guys as sort of like, it's almost like it has the super gorked timbre of something like Enmity or the New Standard Elite bands, but musically it's a little bit more like Last Days of Humanity, but filtered through maybe like weird techie metalcore stuff, like Botch, or like later on Tony Danza, Tap Dance Extravaganza. A lot of the material on this record and on their later EP has like an intense technical edge that I think is interesting, but it's still sort of riffless and viscous and alien in a way that I really like.
These are, that's actually what I was going to say, is that hearing this in light of what I've just heard, it's just like, okay, well, this is literally a band that decided we are going to sound like Enmity plus Last Days of Humanity. Yeah. I mean, I understand the comparison to things like Botch and whatever, but I feel like Enmity and Last Days are both pretty technical in their own ways.
Mm-hmm. They certainly are. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's just because of the crisper production here, it's much more scrutable than either of those bands. The riffs you can much more clearly hear, and they do all kind of sound like Stooges riffs. Da 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 da. Okay, that's I Want to Be Your Dog. But it's more, you can figure out what's going on a little more easily, so the technical flourishes are easier to hear. Mm-hmm. You've heard the whole record. I'm not trying to deny the Botch thing. It's just like, it's easy for me to hear how we get exactly here from just the two previous bands.
Oh no, I totally understand.
Yeah. It's
they're a little like more like I guess it's weird to say these words, typically unhinged. Yeah. In certain ways, they're having a little bit more fun with it than I think either.
Yeah, it's more like an actual band that you can release multiple albums by.
Yeah,
albums with.
So it's they've gotten a sort of cult status. I really hope they do a full length follow up to Failure Prosthesis at one point, and I'm just really charmed to.
Wait.
Sorry.
Yo, sorry. Oh, wait, sorry. So you're charmed to what? Say that, and then I'll say something.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I would be really charmed to see like a follow up to this record, because I think that it's no, what I was going to say was I'm charmed to see that they're like picking up steam, because nobody had heard this band in 2010. I don't know when I first heard them. It was probably in the mid 2010s, but it seems like very slowly they've accumulated a really sincere audience.
What I want to do is just read some of these song titles.
Sure.
Copperoheating Reactor, that we did that one. Crepitation. Bermudian Claustrophobe, Armadildo, Necrophone, let's see, Armed with an Awl, a nod to our bony boys, Oral Tory 13, Gyperboloid's Hunger, The Faces Are Rubbing Against the Emery, Weatherdick Detonator, All Is Not Rolling, All Has Already Rolled. To hell! Let's see. Through the Blunt Hooks. No Flies. All Are There.
And concluding with a Brodequin cover.
Yeah, for sure. I can hear the Brodequin thing for sure.
Yeah. And that is a great segue to our next band. These guys are also from Russia. They are named Excoriation. They've only so far released one full-length record in 2014 on New Standard Elite. There's your Brodequin connection. And it is certainly, compared to the stuff we've heard so far, more conventionally in the New Standard Elite style. But I think it's an absolute apex of it, and the production and timbres on display are so fucking insane. They really take you aback on first listen, just because you're like, what the fuck, you actually produced an album that sounds like this? So let's listen to a little bit of the second track, Infected Interior. I think I first heard this one probably just a couple... Actually, no, probably pretty close to when it was initially released, and I just immediately fell in love. This obviously has a lot more to do with conventional brutal death metal or slam than the other stuff we've heard, but I think that it just points to how much power timbre can have in music like this. There's a way that this record could have been produced and played that would seem pretty straightforward, but the insane reverb, the bizarre sense of like how the instruments are spaced in relation to each other makes this really, really interesting to me.
The tone is awesome.
Oh, dude, it's so vast and empty and weird.
This is definitely a lot more conventionally enjoyable than either of the previous things we've listened to. It's, it does have a certain big, beefy hamburger quality to it, despite the weirdness of it. But yeah, I hear what you mean. It just has a really good tone. Like, as far as a brutal death record, I like this a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the insane, like, swampy wetness of it. I like the...
You could argue that it's the ultimate tone, right, for death
Yeah.
metal. Like, if you were comparing tones, this would just be like... I know there was like some like Latin American subgenre that our boys at Bunsen are into called ultra metal.
Yeah.
That I've never... Right, this is... If you wanted to make a guitar tone that would you just call the ultra tone, this would be it.
Yeah. I like... And I like the darkness of it.
Yeah, it is wet, too. Yeah, it's dark, it's wet.
Yeah, it really... It reminds... stylistically... pretty different, but it reminds me in mood of like Embodied Torment. Really invested in the sort of like perverse horror of the Middle Ages, with a genuine sort of like darkness and sadism that you don't typically find in a lot of bands of this nature. So as I said, released this album in 2014. They released like a single that's supposed to be for a new album a few years back, but they seem to be taking their time, and I really hope it comes out because I'm really waiting for it, and I know a lot of other people are too. And if that happens, I'll absolutely
review it.
Yeah, I'm super stoked. Next up, a band that I have mentioned several times on the show, and that I think a lot of the brutal death side of our listener base is probably really into. We got to talk about Artery Eruption. Artery Eruption is still going. They have broken up and reformed a few times. They have, I believe, their 5th full-length album is going to be coming out soon, titled... in true absurd Artery Eruption fashion, The Holy Grail of Pussy. It actually has incredible album art. It's like really, really
I'm
good.
already looking. Already looking.
Yeah, by John Zig. For those who aren't familiar, Artery Eruption is a slam death band who basically, especially on their first couple records, are so questionable in their instrumental ability, it becomes fascinating avant-garde music. Their first record, Reduced to a Limbless Sex Slave, is really good, but it's very clearly a sort of bumbling attempt to replicate Molesting the Decapitated, and I say that with all affection. My favorite is the second album, Gouging Out Eyes of Mutilated Infants, where they really start to set into their own style a little bit more distinctly. So we'll listen to a couple minutes off the opening track of that album, Scalped, and if high technicality can be something used for art, then maybe impossibly low technicality can be as well.
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive. But not you. Not anymore.
I fucking love it, man.
I think this one actually has the most interesting riffs of anything we've listened to.
Yeah, well, being able to hear them certainly helps, too.
Yeah, no, but there's interesting note choice and timing on them.
Yeah, there certainly is. So Artery Eruption was originally the project of two brothers and I believe an additional drummer, and then over time it's like primarily become the project of Brian Moeller, one of the brothers, and it's interesting because like their fourth album, I think it was called Straight Up the Ass, he had drafted some other musicians from like other brutal death metal bands, and they played too well. Like, it didn't feel the same. It was, like, produced kind of okay, and the playing was pretty tight, and it really didn't have that essence. So, in Facebook posts about the new one, Brian has talked about how they're going back to the studio where they recorded the first album, and I believe he said they're not going to click track anything again. So, clearly these are appreciated qualities of this band by the fans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It is really fascinating music. There are moments on this record and others that are even more sort of discordant and bizarrely timed than this. But I think as far as like creating slam that is a kind of outsider art, there's not really many bands that compete.
Yeah.
I think they're really awesome. I think I've sampled them on the show before, and they're really cool. And good for Brian. Brian, the band had like broken up a few times, but it's like he seems to have like he had some personal troubles with mental health and stuff. It seems like he's doing a lot better. He finished college and stuff. He just seems like he's in a much better place, and it's good to see. Everybody in the brutal death metal scene has always rooted for the guy really hard. And apparently he's a very sweet guy. What's fascinating is that him and his brother are both very devout Christians. And that's actually
interesting.
It's actually a secret element. I had this album as a CD on hard copy, where in the liner notes they say that this album is dedicated to all the whores who kill their unborn babies. You will burn in hell for all eternity. I remember when I saw that, I was like, wow, I had no idea that was the logic here. But okay.
They must have a long... they must take a long time in the confession booth.
I would imagine so.
So anyways, I was jerking it to the... And the priest was like, holy shit.
Oh, God, man.
God. Yeah. All right, 20 minutes left on the clock. 20 minutes left on the clock.
It's like, now you can't leave in the middle of a confession. I know the rules. You got to stay here for the whole thing.
Yeah.
All right. So next up, we're going to go down to Colombia. Mindly Rotten is a band that, again, seems to be a common thread with a lot of these, was sort of an obscure offshoot of the better-known Colombian brutal death metal scene at the time. Their debut record, The Most Exquisite Agonies, released in 2005, was known by some weirdos and thought of generally positively, but it didn't make a huge mark compared to other better-known bands. Over the years, though, this has been reappraised, I would say probably, in a large part by, like, younger guys who are more easily able to appreciate the kind of level of extremity here. And this has sort of ended up a minor classic of that scene, which I'm very happy to see. I've shown you some Colombian-style brutal death before, and Mindly Rotten on this album plays it way past the breaking point. So let's listen to, it's a shorter one, so we'll listen to the whole track, Old Iniquity. Raise your cortisol enough?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, okay, that has some interesting riffs on it.
Oh, yeah.
Especially the thing at the beginning. Those are, they're kind of, we've, I think, talked before about the Morbid Angel influence in Colombian Brutal Death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This certainly has it, and not in the way I would expect. You know, usually expect kind of more like the thrashy riffs, but there's some kind of like epic melodies here if you smooth them out.
Yeah, and the smoothing out
It's kind of like Blessed Are the Sick melodies.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And the smoothing out is very important, because I think that this is a band that is emblematic of this particular thing in the Colombian style that I find so fascinating, which is that each member individually is a phenomenal musician, but it feels like they are playing to like different click tracks. These songs are barely hanging on together, which I think is one of the things that makes this style so exciting. You know,
it's what you described as the viscera sliding across each other sound.
Yeah. Insalubrity from Ecuador.
Mm-hmm.
We covered them. That was sort of the.
Oh right, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, that was.
Continually misgender them as Colombians.
Oh no, yeah. So the Ecuadorian bands, I mean, they're hanging out with the Colombian bands all the time. It's basically the same style.
All right.
Yeah. So, but they were absolutely playing within this style. And this is just like Mindly Rotten really played the most unhinged and chaotic incarnation of that. It is really difficult to keep a hold on as these songs are playing, but you know, that's one of the things that makes them so exciting and so awesome. They did a couple records after this that are fine but much more normal, and they've just never really managed to recapture the essence here.
Well, I'm really excited to get to this next record because I already opened it and I can see the cover.
Yes. So for our last one, we're going to bring everything back full circle. So this has been, in a large part, an episode about the idea of death metal transcending heavy metal. And you can do that in a lot of ways. You can do that by sort of avoiding the riff as the defining songwriting element. You can do it by experimenting with timbres, with drum machines, with strange concepts of timing and technicality, or lack of technicality in some cases. But what if we took all those ideas, especially those of just sheer timbre and extremity, and we brought it back to death metal? We brought it back to Morbid Angel and Hate Eternal and Deicide and Chrysion and stuff like that. Well, there's a record that fulfills that, and what's crazy is it's actually the earliest, in terms of release date, of all of the records that we've covered today. This is Carnal from Colombia. This is their record True Blasphemy that was released in 2002, which is maligned by many people for having bizarre production, but I think within the context of what we've heard, we're all going to learn something today. So let's listen to...
This one has the devil on the front.
Let's listen to Judgment Day with Satan. Dude, doesn't that sound like some bizarre shit I would find on Bandcamp and bring onto the show today?
Yeah, I mean, this is just actually really good. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's so weird. I
can see what they mean about the production. The production is unusually sterile for... If you thought that this was going to be like a Chrysian Morbid Angel type band, the production is really weird for this. But it makes sense. It's just a, very cold, empty, brutal death production. Although it does sound kind of like Enmity.
Yeah, it does. But I think it's fascinating, like, how, bringing in those, like, just Morbid Angel and Deicide riffs again, actually, it recontextualizes them completely. Even sort of, like, more traditional death metal phrases, given these very strange timbres and modes of delivery, feel so sort of refreshed and new. It's so fascinating. It really sort of opens up possibilities for, like, hey, what if we just start playing with timbre really hard? What if we use sort of, like, typical songwriting techniques or riff ideas, but just play around with the edges with how these things sound on a very elemental level?
Yeah, it really shows you, it reminds you also just how atonal and strange a lot of those classic Florida death metal riffs are. Like, hearing them in this totally alien context shows you how alien they always were.